Hey folks, this says that it has gone live, and while we wait for the Facebook people to come in, I'm going to answer at least one question that I saw, and that is someone asked, why do I always say I like Pittsburgh? What's not to like? It's a beautiful area. It's got phenomenal history. It's uh, got amazing art. It's got world-class educational facilities. It's got great restaurants. I don't live there obviously, but I always enjoy going to Pittsburgh and that part of the country. It's such a pretty part of the country. So yeah, I have a spot for Pittsburgh. It is not my favorite city. I do have a favorite city. Um, it's Memphis. Um, Although I like many cities, Memphis is another one where the history and the natural beauty and of course, the music and the food and everything, I just adore, and the architecture in Memphis, because it was never really renovated in the period when they were putting up so many ugly buildings, just always makes it a joy to go to Memphis as well. But there are a lot of ones I like. All right. So I'm not sure we're seeing Facebook yet. Let's see if they come in. We're having trouble interfacing with Facebook these days. So maybe they're here, maybe they're not here. Um, so I just saw somebody is here from Memphis, and I didn't see what you said about. Oh, there we got another Memphis person here. Nashville. Nashville's an interesting place as well. I am not seeing Facebook come in, which if you are here from Facebook, I'd love it if you would identify yourselves, because I kind of like to make sure that we're broadcasting there too, but it has not, I haven't been showing up there as much as I should be. So maybe they're just not going to be able to come in today, which is unfortunate. It says I'm broadcasting over there, but I'm not seeing anybody here. All right, well, why don't I get a jump on it, and then maybe it'll show up on Facebook later. So first of all, thank you for being here. Second of all, you had a lot of questions. Oh, here's Facebook. All of a sudden, hi, Facebook people. We whipped by, so I'm not sure if Danny is here. If you are Danny, I know I owe you a letter, and I am on it in a number of different ways. And here's Nashville and Arizona and Wisconsin. I will tell you, on Tuesday when I did the other politics chat, it was like 100 degrees in here. And today it's so cold that over at our house, Buddy's got a fire going. Welcome to life in Maine, right? All right, so now let me get down to it and hit some of the questions that you asked about. You're asking a lot of questions about why President Donald Trump is so adamant that, in fact, he destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities in those strikes over the weekend. And one of the funny things that's happened with that over the last 2 days is he has started to say that the reason he cares so deeply is because people are disrespecting the pilots who flew the planes that dropped the bombs. And that's a really weird, if you will, distraction, because nobody is saying that the military didn't do their job. I literally have not seen that anywhere except coming from him, because he's trying to make this seem like he's doing something, for the military. And come on, let's call it. He doesn't do anything for the military. So it's just that's a weird thing. But it's part of his absolute determination to sell Americans on a story. And I actually think there's a number of things going on with that. The first thing that I think, and by the way, feel free to disagree. This is just sort of my impressions from looking at this. And of course, I do not have any view into Trump's inner circle. So this is me looking from the outside in. But one of the things that really jumps out to me is the degree to which Trump has conceived of his strikes on Iran as sort of a TV series, that sort of a made for TV movie. Because if you remember, when Israel struck Iran, the United States was supposed to be negotiating with Iran 2 days later. And Trump was like, no, we're going to go with negotiations. Israel bombs Iran. And when that happened, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who was also the acting national security advisor, came out and said, we had nothing to do with it. That was a unilateral move. We're not doing that. And within a day, Trump was sort of hinting that he'd kind of been behind it. And now we know from reporting from within the White House, from sources within the White House, that he was watching on the Fox News channel and saw how it was reporting those Israeli strikes as being, interesting and powerful and a success and so on. And he wanted in on that. So he devised this strike and this storyline that said that he, after many decades now of Americans trying to negotiate with the Iranians over their nuclear weapons program, and I talked last Tuesday about the history of that. Um, and the complaints of Republicans that America wasn't simply bombing Iran, even though the negotiations for the joint JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was the Iran nuclear deal, that was working. But they still seem to want to bomb it because that's sort of their, that whole power dynamic that they're going to dominate things is very much embedded in the Republican Party at this point. So he did that, and then he instantly said, "I've totally obliterated their nuclear program." It's way too early to tell. It's going to be a very long time before anybody has any definitive answers. But then almost immediately he named it. He gave it a name, almost like a title, the 12-Day War. And the reason that I'm mentioning that today is because he continues to insist that this is what happened, even though the Pentagon itself has said, no, we think there was damage done, but the system is not obliterated. And this morning, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth gave a press conference in which he was really combative, seemingly very angry. Remember, he's a media guy himself. And he literally said, and I think I can quote it here, yes, he insisted that the president had completely obliterated Iran's nuclear weapons program and said, and I quote, President Trump directed the most complex and secretive military operation in history, and it was a resounding success, resulting in a ceasefire agreement and the end of the 12-Day War. Doesn't that sound like the description of a movie or something? And of course, it's ridiculous, too, if you want to say that strike was successful. That's one thing, but it certainly was not the most complex and secretive military operation in history, to which people point to things like D-Day, which on June 6, 1944, took a year of planning, involved soldiers and sailors from 13 different nations and their commanders and their political leaders, and ended up involving more than 150,000 soldiers and almost 200,000 sailors. So the idea that somehow Trump has one-upped D-Day with this strike on Iran is just fantasy. It's just a fantasy. So why? Partly because I think he loves this package. It's a made-for-TV moment, but also partly because he is having a real problem right now with reality. And I don't mean that just personally, although I think he is personally having a hard time with reality. I think he is having an extremely difficult time separating out what is real and what is not. But also because as he is putting his fantasy into place, the American people don't like it and they're pushing back, and he's in real trouble. And I'll tell you more about that in just a minute with his numbers. But he wants us to believe his world, not our reality. He wants to say, this is what is really happening. And I'm going to shut up the media and I'm going to shut up the Pentagon. And this is real because this is what I want to be real. So I think that's part of it. So that's one. The first is the made for TV thing. The second is that he wants us to believe his reality rather than actual reality. And this has sort of a larger version of the argument that his inaugural crowds were bigger than Barack Obama's, which was also just ridiculous on the face of it. But he insisted on it. And that is a sign of a rising authoritarian when they're determined for you to believe their reality rather than your own. Because even if you don't actually believe them, if you say you believe them, you're kind of stuck in their world. But then I think there is quite possibly a third thing. And that is, we learned today from CNN, a CNN exclusive, that all the while that the Trump administration has been talking to Iran in, theoretically to come up with a new way to limit their nuclear capabilities, their nuclear weapons capabilities, members of the administration have also been engaged in secret talks to try to end Iran's nuclear weapons aspirations with a series of benefits to Iran that probably will not play well in the United States. So the CNN reporters say that on the table right now are secret talks to ease the sanctions on Iran, to free up billions of dollars of assets of Iran's that have been frozen, and also to help Iran get between 20 and 30, let me get the right number here, 20 and 30 billion dollars to build their own nuclear plants for nuclear energy. And the reason I mean, that's a CNN story. I have not yet seen the reactions to that CNN story. But all of a sudden, it made me recall, I don't know if you remember this, but in 2016, when Trump's campaign for president actually seemed to be taking off because it had really been in the toilet, basically. And Paul Manafort came on board, and remember, and he starts to get help from Russian operatives and so on. Well, in that summer of 2016, Jared Kushner and Michael Flynn, who was later to be Trump's national security advisor, and he had to resign. And after it turned out he was talking to the Russians and shouldn't have been. And then he lied to the FBI, and, that's its own rabbit hole I won't go into. But they started a company, and the company was called IP3 International. And IP3 International stood for something peace and prosperity. International, I think. Let's see. Yeah. International Peace, Power, and Prosperity. And that was a company that was designed to work with Russia to build nuclear reactors in Saudi Arabia. So obviously Iran was not involved in that, as far as I know, from the public material stuff. But that idea of building nuclear reactors in the Middle East is not brand new for this administration. And I don't know what it means. I don't know how it's going to fall out. I just know there was a lot of mess over IP3 and the fact that the first Trump administration was trying to get nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. And there was all kinds, you can Google that, there was all kinds of brouhaha about that because it looked like they were violating a law when they did that. But that may be another reason that he's trying to say, I obliterated their nuclear program, now we can all be friends again, which in fact is what he put on his social media accounts. Congratulations, world, we have peace now. So that he could switch the conversation from, we've got this problem with nuclear proliferation in Iran, to, that's okay, I took care of that. Now we can help probably the other Arab states rebuild Iran, and we will be able to put in these nuclear reactors. I don't know. And that's that's out there now in a way that, quite frankly, I was surprised by, but it doesn't ring false to me because of that earlier IP3 program. All right. That's not all you asked about, though. You asked about the budget reconciliation bill that the Republicans have called the One Big Beautiful Bill. And that's just its name, which is one of the reasons people keep using that, is that it's its official name. When they write a bill, either the House or the Senate, there is a number attached to it. It's either HR 101 or S101. I'm making that up, for House of Representatives or Senate. And then usually they will also name a bill. So it's got a number and a name, and the numbers are far more useful if you're trying to look it up and follow it. So you can actually, if you want to Google this, I'm using that word generically. If you want to put this into your search engine, if you put in the number of the bill, you will actually get the legislative history of the bill, including a summary of it, and information from the clerks who put all that stuff out there. You can learn more about it too if you want, but that's a good place to start. Anyway, the trick to that bill is that it needs to go through the Congress under what's called budget reconciliation. And the reason that matters is because, and I've talked about this a million times, so some of you are going to be bored when I say this again. The Senate filibuster is basically a reflection of the fact that the Senate never developed a way to make its members stop talking. The House of Representatives got big enough, quickly enough, that they recognized they did have to have a way to shut people up. And so they have a system for saying the debate's over, now we're going to move forward. The Senate doesn't have that. So the Senate filibuster is essentially just, senators can keep talking forever if they want to. You can't shut them up unless the Senate votes with 60 votes to do that. It's called cloture, if you've seen that. And that means that essentially a member of the Senate could stop legislation ever from happening if they could simply hold the floor forever so that nothing could move forward. They changed that rule, I think it was in the 1970s, to say you didn't actually have to stand and filibuster. You didn't actually have to stand and talk any longer and hold the floor. You could just say you were going to do that. And the Senate decided that in order to actually get some business done, they had to exempt certain categories from the filibuster. So say you can't filibuster this. So you can't filibuster certain judgeships, for example. And one of the things you cannot filibuster as a senator are certain kinds of financial measures, so that the government actually, one person can't shut down the entire US government. It makes sense. And one of those measures is budget reconciliation. So budget reconciliation measures can make it through the Senate with a simple majority. They cannot be filibustered. All right, and that was designed to mean that you would just get them through, and people wouldn't fight about them over partisan things. You'd just make sure they got through. Mind you, I'm not defending these. I think there's a huge number of problems with the way Congress runs today. And I don't like these giant bills. But anyway, so because the Republicans have razor thin majorities in both the House and the Senate, and because a lot of what they want is enormously unpopular, especially what the MAGA Republicans want, Trump insisted on putting everything they want into his one big, beautiful bill, the budget reconciliation bill, because they could get it all through with a majority vote, and there was nothing the Democrats could do about it. So this is what we have been talking about now for months, is that the Republicans shoved everything into that bill, horrible stuff into that bill. And one of the things that people like me has been focusing on a lot is the fact that it dramatically cuts Medicaid over the next 10 years, and it extends Trump's tax cuts from 2017, so that a lot of the government programs that we like, not just Medicaid, but also the supplemental nutrition assistance programs, or SNAP, what we used to know as food stamps, but many different aspects of the government that we like, including energy credits, for example, that are helping America to wean itself off fossil fuels, and which actually polls show are enormously popular. Those things were in the bill, as well as some of the other things that you have heard about, things like making it very difficult to enforce a contempt of court act, for example, selling off some of the public lands. There's a whole bunch of things that were in that bill. So they put everything in that bill with the idea that they were just going to be able to shove it through under budget reconciliation. But much of that bill is enormously unpopular. I mean, crazy unpopular. That bill is underwater so far. I think the number of people who actually like it is like 27%. It's that low. And then the people who hate it are in the 50% range. So, high. So the Republicans have a real problem, because Trump wants that bill. He wants those tax cuts. That's really huge for him. He wants those tax cuts. And at the same time, the Republicans, especially the Republican senators and representatives who are in vulnerable districts, are like, if we slash Medicaid, we're done here, because slashing Medicaid will not only hurt the people who are on Medicaid, it will dramatically hurt especially rural areas whose hospitals and nursing homes depend on Medicaid supplements. So you're actually looking at the closure of a lot of hospitals and elder care facilities, which will hit rural areas especially really, really hard. I know, I live in one. So the Republicans have been like, we're not keen on what we're doing here. And Trump's saying, but you got to pass it, you got to pass it, you got to pass it. Well, that's where they're sitting right now. And the Republican senators, a lot of them are like, we just cannot pass this. We're going to get shellacked in the next election. So what's happening right now is that the Senate has an officer called the Senate parliamentarian, which good luck spelling, by the way. I was writing about it recently and I finally gave up. The Senate parliamentarian, see, there you go. The Senate parliamentarian is a nonpartisan person who looks at legislation in the Senate and says, yeah, this is legal. You can do this. Your rules and the regulations of the Senate and the laws say you can do this. But no, you can't do that. And what the Senate parliamentarian, a woman named Elizabeth McDonough, who has been in the job since 2012, has said is she looked at this bill, which is over 1,000 pages long, and she has been going through it and saying, you can't do this under budget reconciliation, because remember I said it had to be related to the budget. It was financial. So one of the things she tossed out today was cuts to Medicaid. And she's thrown out some of the other stuff as well, including the thing about making it so difficult to enforce a contempt of court order. So right now, what's happening is the Senate parliamentarian is saying, I'm telling you, you can't have these things in this bill. And the trick is that she really has no electoral authority. The Senate could override her. They could vote to say, we're not going to listen to her. And a lot of the MAGA Republicans want to do that. But Senator John Thune, who was the Senate Majority Leader, today said, we're not going to do that. And that's a really interesting thing on his part, because in a way, it's really helpful for the Republicans not to have to go on record as cutting Medicaid, for example. There's a lot of really unpopular things in that bill that they didn't really want to vote on. And she has taken them out, or she said, you need to take these things out so that they can vote in favor of the bill that Trump wants, but then the things that she has stripped out, they can be like, sorry, we couldn't do that, and sort of shift the blame onto her. But the downside of that for them, in the popular view, that's a really good thing for them, because most people don't understand about the Senate parliamentarian, so they can be like, no, we stripped that out of the bill. But the MAGA Republicans don't want those tax cuts, which are going to explode the deficit and explode the debt even more. Here's actually a little piece that you may not know. You know, the deficit is the yearly amount, how much the United States brings in revenue versus how much it sends out in programs and debt payments and so on. That is one number. But when they figure the debt, when economists figure the debt, they also have to figure in the amount of interest one pays on the debt. So there's a difference between the deficit and the debt, but there's also a difference in the way we look at the numbers. Even if you say I'm cutting this much out, we're going to be this much in the red this year, that's a certain number. When you shift it into the debt, it actually has to bear the interest costs of funding that debt. And so that number is going to be higher. Anyway, that was a rabbit hole, but I think it's an interesting one. And that's why you often see two numbers. Someone says, oh, it's going to blow up the deficit by this much, but the debt by this much plus stuff. And you're like, why is that? That's why. Anyway, the MAGA Republicans don't want to blow up the debt or the deficit. And they're adamant that they don't want to do that. So if the Senate parliamentarian has stripped those numbers out, they may not want to pass the bill at all. And Trump is insisting it has to be passed by July 4th, which is right around the corner. So that's where that bill stands now, and you should continue to speak up about it. I'll speak more about that in just a minute. All right. The other things that you asked about are, one is you asked why the number of Democrats voted not to go forward with impeachment recently. And you can disagree with this, by the way, but the reason for that is, first of all, not to interrupt what's that old saying about don't interrupt your enemy when they're destroying themselves? Trump has overreached so extraordinarily in so many ways that his numbers are plummeting. So one of the numbers that came out, I think it was yesterday, it might have been today, from Quinnipiac University, which does polling, does good polling, is that since Trump started his deportations of well, a lot of people, not just undocumented immigrants. But since he has begun that, um, American support among registered voters, and there's another little bit of a rabbit hole. People often do polling and they talk about Americans versus sometimes they talk about registered voters. That's a really important distinction because Americans rarely like what the Republicans are doing, but not all Americans show up to vote. Registered voters are people who show up to vote. So registered voters since Trump took office have swung 14 points toward wanting a path to legal citizenship for people who are already in this country. Like, you can't produce numbers like that with any kind of advocacy in the world, except people being horrified by what he's doing. Similarly, Trump's trade war has prices are rising significantly already. Today, he said he has inked a deal with China, which is news to everybody, suggests that he doesn't know what he's doing. The things that he is doing to himself are really damaging to him. And the idea, I suspect, behind the Democrats who say we shouldn't move forward now with impeachment, although heaven knows, I said we were in a constitutional crisis the first day he was in office, is that it will shift focus off of those things that are making people really angry and turning them against the administration and shift them on to impeachment. At which point the MAGA Republicans are going to come out swinging in favor of Trump. And that's really going to change the national dynamic. Because one of the things that somebody said today, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, that I thought was really interesting, is that if you think about they were only talking about one particular thing, but if you think about the things that Trump has embroiled himself in, the trade war, certainly the stuff with attacking the migrants in our midst, he doesn't really have a way out. It looks, as somebody said, like LBJ in Vietnam. Once he is in it, it's very, very difficult to find a way out. What can he do now to get out of the mess he has made with immigration without upsetting his base? And he can't stay in without upsetting the rest of us. Similarly, on the trade war, how does he extricate himself from that? He has done so by saying, oh, I'm going to ink all these deals and they're going to be great. But, so far that has not materialized. So there's a lot of reason for the Democrats simply to spend their time pushing back on him in public, which is what they're doing. And they're doing it, fairly effectively, but simply staying out of his way as he is destroying himself is not a bad strategy. In the long term, of course, it's enormously painful in the short term. But I think that's probably what they're doing. And like I say, I'm explaining it. I'm not suggesting you have to agree with it. I think I know I'm a Libra, but it does seem to me that there are very good arguments on both sides. And I would be happy to make the other argument as well. Don't even start me. But I think that's what they're doing. That's what you asked. The other thing that I think is really important in this moment that you asked about, so I'll throw it in here, is Zohran Mamdani's election to be the Democratic candidate for mayor in New York City in the upcoming election. Because I think what we are seeing in this moment, and of course it's hard because we're in it, but the overreach of the Trump administration, the extraordinary overreach that has really made it crystal clear that the MAGA Republicans are in this to line their own pockets. And certainly the Trump family is in it to line his own pocket. I mean, come on, the airplane from Qatar, and that's who it was, right? Or whoever it was. And the deals with foreign countries and the crypto. I mean, the criming is off the charts here. And at the same time, the willingness of the Republicans to freaking cut Medicaid and SNAP. I mean, go after the weakest people among us. And then to turn around and have talked in the campaign about getting rid of murderers and rapists. And then, dragging off the street a landscaper whose 3 sons were Marines, and mothers and children, and separating children it's really, really extreme and illustrates the degree to which our system has been taken over by a very small group of people who are commandeering it for their own benefit. And the rest of us can, you know, go hang as far as they're concerned. So, and the comparison that I'm making here in my mind anyway is to the late 19th century. When that happens, when enough people recognize that has happened, they start to look for new leaders. And one of the things that the Democrats did after 1965, when we get the Voting Rights Act of 65, the parties have to decide what they're going to do. And immediately after 65, the Republican Party under Nixon in 68 really moves along the lines that Barry Goldwater had outlined in 1964. That is, they start down the path to white supremacy. They start to divide the American people quite deliberately. It was a strategy called positive polarization. Positive because it would turn out people to vote for Republicans, is what the way they conceived it. That ended up where we are now, where we have a very small group of largely white Americans who are turning on the rest of us. And they went down that path, but the Democrats didn't. The Democrats started in 68 in their incredibly messy convention that year. But then in the years after 68 into 72, reworking their system to make it far more inclusive. And what they got for that in 72 was an absolute landslide for the Republicans. They ended up with their candidate, George McGovern of South Dakota, winning only the state of Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. He didn't even win his own home state, which is almost impossible for somebody to lose their home state. And when that happened, and going, of course, then we got Watergate and we got Jimmy Carter, who was an incredibly impressive man in a number of ways, a really impressive man, and an impressive president, by the way. But we got Jimmy Carter, and then Carter lost, obviously, in 1980 to Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan's going down that path. The Democrats had gone down a different path under Carter in the 70s and under Carter, but a lot of Democrats then looked at Reagan and the fact Reagan picked up the American white working class and said, we need to be more like Reagan. Instead of saying, screw it, we're going to run down this aisle, they kind of worked more with the establishment. Now, they didn't fall in entirely with the Republican, the things they could in the space of a country that had begun to embrace that Reagan revolution. You see Bill Clinton, for example, and the Democrats under Clinton dramatically expanding the right to vote in 1993 with the Motor Voter Act and trying to protect different aspects of the social safety net that the Republicans were coming for and so on. And of course, under Clinton, we get a balanced budget. And the first thing that happens when George W. Bush takes over is he blows that up because he doesn't want the government to have the programs that Americans want. So the Democrats kind of are trying to preserve that care for ordinary Americans, but it was within sort of the parameters of a world that was looking much more like a right center country than a center country than it had been. Well, when you look then at the past 40 years in the United States and you look at the media that has blamed the Democrats for that, much more than the Republicans who were putting in place the tax cuts that did, in fact, move $50 trillion from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. Especially younger Americans look at this system and they say, we don't want any part of this. We want something different. And that, I think, is where you get the nomination of somebody like Mamdani, who is a self-declared democratic socialist. But a lot of what people who call themselves democratic socialists embrace in the 1950s would literally have been a Republican program. So that refocusing, I think, is an incredibly interesting moment. But I also think it is going to be rough. I think everything's going to be rough. Who am I kidding? But the reason I say that is because we went through something very similar in the late 19th century. And what happened was, as soon as the Democrats in the late 19th century started to speak out against the robber barons under people like Grover Cleveland, who was enormously popular. I mean, it's interesting, he's been read out of the history books. As soon as that happened, opponents were like, he's a socialist, he's a communist, these people need to be thrown out of America, et cetera, which is literally what Andy Ogles of Tennessee said today about Mamdani. You start to see this idea, this sort of last gasp of, if we let these people have power, we're going to become a communist country. Well, at this point, America has crossed over the line into authoritarianism on the right. So the idea that somehow somebody who is saying that we should actually build affordable housing is going to destroy the country is, again, part of a fantasy. But when that happened, in those early elections in the 1890s, there were a few people who were actually far to the left of Mamdani who were elected, but there was a backlash against them, which made it quite hard for them to get elected or to govern once they were in power. But what happened, at least in the 19th century, and it's worth thinking about this and what might happen now, is that younger politicians looked at the popularity of the programs that these people were putting forward. And some of the programs, by the way, in the late 19th century were kind of bonkers. We know that now, but at the time they didn't really understand how government financing worked or whatever. But they looked at that and they said, I want those voters. And those programs aren't such a bad idea. And from that, you saw younger politicians, including in the Republican pro-robber baron party at the time, embracing those reforms that had been originally associated with the Democrats or with socialists, and embracing them themselves and bringing them into the major parties. So by 1900, both major parties were calling for reform. And by 1912, there were four major people people from major parties running for president. And in that election, all four of them were progressive candidates. So for me, he'll be running as the Democratic candidate in the mayoral election. That election and the fact that he has gotten the power he has and rejected Cuomo, who, let's face it, was not a good candidate, is about New York for sure, which is always its own microcosm or macrocosm. It's a pretty big city. But it's also about this political moment where I think across the country, Americans are looking at the skewing of this system toward a very few wealthy people that has taken the ability to work hard and rise away from huge numbers of Americans, especially young Americans. And they're saying, we're done. This is not the country we want to live in. And that's a watershed. At least it feels like a watershed moment. So we'll see. You asked my take on it. And that's what my take is on that. Regardless of what Mamdani is proposing, regardless of what the other people are proposing, regardless of the details, the larger picture seems to be a picture of a population that has said, enough is enough. We need to get our democracy back. All right. Once again, I am going to urge you now of all times to speak up about what you want for this country, and you do it at all the usual levels, at the local level, go to meetings, at the state level, same thing, at the national level, reach out to anybody who is in an elected office, run for elected office, but also show up to school board meetings or to church meetings or to any of the public spaces where people care about our country and care about issues that maybe I don't mention very often: fixing the roads, protecting the alewives. I'm here in Maine, protecting the public lands, protecting the universities, the things that you care about, and talk about why that's important to you. Because it is very clear to me from somebody like Mamdani that politicians are listening, and they are listening, the younger ones, the ones who are just up and running now. And the more they hear from you about the things you care about, the more likely it is that that's going to get translated into action. So that, and continuing to recognize that there is joy in creation and there is joy in hard work, and that where we are is really miserable in a lot of ways, but it's also a time to meet new people and to try new things and to reach out and make your own life the most creative it can be. Because I keep reiterating, authoritarianism cannot thrive in a land where people are making community connections and are doing so with joy. So I urge you to keep on doing whatever it is that makes you want to keep on. And one last thing, I have been extraordinarily fortunate in the interviews that I have been able to do lately. And I am excited tomorrow at 4 o'clock, and we'll post it. So if you can't make it, don't worry about it, to be able to interview Zach Everson, who is a journalist from Forbes that I don't know personally, but he writes about crypto and about how crypto is important now, both for the administration and for the things it's doing, like making it an asset that you can consider for a mortgage and so on, for backstopping a mortgage. And I don't know what he's going to say. I don't even know what kind of an interview it's going to be. But I'm really, speaking of reaching into, that's what made me think of it. Speaking of reaching into things that you're good at and that you care about, I love to hear people talk about things that they care about and that they're knowledgeable about. And I suddenly have a platform where I can talk to people who know stuff and are willing to talk to me about it. And so I invite you to come listen to what Zach has to say so we can figure out this crypto thing and what they're, I'm sorry to say, what they seem to be pulling on us. And if you can't see it, then you can see it on my YouTube channel, which some of you are on now, and on Facebook as well. All right, thank you for being here, and I will see you tomorrow if you're around. Otherwise, I will be back on Tuesday. Thanks for being here.